In the depths of space, where steel hulks drift between dying stars, and alien empires measure strength in the sharpness of their claws, humanity was considered nothing more than clever prey. The Zephyrian Dominion had cataloged thousands of species across their hunting grounds. Some fought with plasma and rage, others cowered in their burrows, but all eventually fell to superior predatory instinct that had evolved over millions of years. Then came the humans, not with weapons blazing or shields raised, but with something far more dangerous than any military might the galaxy had ever witnessed. Something so simple, so fundamentally alien to every predator species in known space, that would reshape the very foundation of interstellar civilization. It started with a single gesture. A human woman, captured and caged alongside the Dominion's prized young hunters, did something that should have been meaningless. She reached up and ran her fingers through her hair, smoothing the tangled strands with gentle, methodical strokes. The predator cubs watched. They learned. And in that moment of innocent imitation, they began to change in ways that would send shockwaves through an empire built on eternal hunt and dominance. What the Zephyrian overlords would discover was that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their warfare. It was their capacity to turn the fiercest predators in the galaxy into something they had never been before. Something gentle. The cargo hold of the Zephyrian vessel Bloodhawk reeked of fear and metal. Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her back against the cold wall, feeling the vibrations of the massive ship's engines through the steel plating. Around her, 24 other humans huddled in similar positions, their faces pale in the dim red lighting that the Zephyrians preferred. The air recyclers wheezed with an alien rhythm, processing oxygen just barely within human tolerance. Sarah studied her captors through the energy barrier that separated their holding area from the rest of the ship. The Zephyrians moved with predatory grace, their elongated limbs carrying them in fluid motions that spoke of countless generations of evolution honed for the hunt. Their heads resembled crosses between wolves and raptors, with powerful jaws filled with serrated teeth and large, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Lean muscle moved beneath mottled gray and black skin that seemed to shift and adapt to their surroundings. "They're looking at us like we're dinner," whispered Marcus, a mining engineer who had been captured during the raid on Kepler Station. His hands shook as he spoke, and Sarah noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the Zephyrian guards. "No," Sarah replied quietly, her anthropologist training kicking in despite their circumstances. "Look at how they move, how they position themselves. This isn't about food. We're specimens." She had spent 15 years studying predator-prey relationships across different species, both on Earth and the handful of colony worlds humanity had managed to establish before first contact with the Zephyrian Dominion. The Dominion's arrival had been swift and devastating. Humanity's military forces, impressive by their own standards, had lasted exactly 47 hours against an empire that had been perfecting the art of conquest for over 10,000 years. The Zephyrians hadn't come to destroy humanity completely. That much was clear from the selective nature of their raids. They took samples from each world, scientists, engineers, artists, children. They were building a collection, and Sarah suspected she knew why. A low rumble echoed through the ship as something massive docked with their vessel. The Zephyrians immediately straightened, their casual demeanor shifting to something that resembled military attention. Sarah watched as the cargo bay's main door's iris opened, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness. "Great Commander Vex approaches," one of the guard announced, its voice a growling series of clicks and whistles that the translation implants made barely intelligible. "Present the human specimens for inspection." The energy barrier flickered and died. 2 Zephyrians moved into the holding area, their movements precise and economical. They wore no visible weapons, but Sarah knew from the briefings she'd received before Kepler Station's fall that their natural claws and teeth were more than sufficient for handling soft species like humans. "Form a line," the lead guard commanded, gesturing with a clawed hand. "No sudden movements. No attempts at aggression." You exist at the great commander's pleasure. The humans slowly complied, helping each other stand on unsteady legs. Sarah found herself near the front of the group, directly in line with the corridor entrance. As they waited, she could hear the approaching footsteps, heavier than those of the guards, accompanied by the soft whisper of what sounded like ceremonial robes. Great Commander Vex entered the cargo bay like a living shadow. Where the guards were lean hunters, Vex was something altogether more imposing. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with broader shoulders and darker coloring, the commander moved with the confidence of an apex predator that had never encountered anything capable of threatening it. Intricate scarification covered the visible portions of its skin, telling stories of hunts and conquests in a language Sarah couldn't begin to decipher. Most unsettling were Vex's eyes. Unlike the guards, whose gazes held the focused intensity of working hunters, the great commander studied the human prisoners with something that resembled intellectual curiosity. It moved slowly down the line, pausing before each captive, occasionally reaching out with one clawed finger to tilt a head or examine hands. When Vex reached Sarah, those large predator eyes locked onto hers. She fought every instinct that screamed at her to look away, to show submission. Instead, she met the alien's gaze steadily, letting her own scientific curiosity show. For a long moment, they studied each other across the vast evolutionary gulf that separated their species. "This one," Vex said finally, its voice a deep rumble that the translator rendered in crisp, clinical tones. "This one sees us truly, not as demons or monsters, but as we are." "Great Commander," one of the guards inquired. "She will go to the observation deck, the others to standard holding." Vex moved away from Sarah, continuing down the line. "Begin preparation for the next phase of the collection protocol. The young ones must be ready to receive their new companions." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. She had suspected the Zephyrians were collecting humans for study, but the mention of young ones and companions suggested something far more complex than simple xenobiology research. 2 guards flanked her as Vex completed the inspection. The other humans were led away through a different corridor, and Sarah caught Marcus's frightened glance as he was shepherded past. She wanted to offer some word of comfort, but the guards were already guiding her toward the iris door through which the great commander had entered. The corridors beyond the cargo bay were wider and better lit, with bioluminescent strips along the walls that cast everything in a soft blue-green glow. Sarah noticed that the decoration was minimal but purposeful, carved symbols that suggested both artistic sensibility and practical function, like navigation markers that also served as territorial displays. They passed through several more sections of the ship before arriving at what the guards had called the observation deck. The iris door opened to reveal a space that took Sarah's breath away despite her circumstances. The deck was a transparent dome that offered an unobstructed view of space, but that wasn't what captured her attention. The room was filled with young Zephyrians, cubs, she realized, though they were each nearly as large as an adult human. They moved with the awkward energy of adolescent predators, their movements not yet refined into the deadly grace she had observed in the adults. And there were other species present as well. Sarah counted at least 6 different alien forms, all clearly young, all showing the same uncertain energy as the Zephyrian cubs. Some resembled the crystalline Veltar she had read about in the intelligence reports. Others were completely unfamiliar. All of them wore collars that glowed with the same energy signature as the barriers on the ship. "You will observe," Vex commanded, gesturing toward a raised platform at one side of the dome. "You will record. You will help us understand what makes your species unique among our collections." Sarah was led to the platform, where she found a chair clearly designed for human proportions. It faced the central area where the young aliens moved and played, if the territorial displays and mock hunting behaviors could be called play. A recording device was mounted beside the chair, its alien design nevertheless familiar enough in function. "What am I supposed to be observing?" Sarah asked, as the guard secured her to the chair with energy restraints. Vex studied her for a moment before responding. We have conquered 1,047 species across this galaxy. We have taken their young, raised them as our own, trained them in the ways of the hunt. All have adapted successfully to Zephyrian culture within 3 generations. The great commander moved closer, its presence radiating a mixture of pride and puzzlement that Sarah found oddly easy to read despite the species barrier. But the human cubs we have collected, Vex continued, they resist our training in ways we do not understand. They show no aggression toward each other. They share resources without competition. They demonstrate protective behaviors toward the weak rather than culling them. Our behavioral specialists believe they are defective, but you humans continue to show the same patterns across all age groups. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. You're trying to turn human children into Zephyrian hunters. We are trying to understand why we cannot, Vex corrected. Every species we have encountered operates according to predator-prey dynamics. The strong hunt, the weak are hunted. This is the fundamental law of existence. Yet your species seems to have evolved beyond this basic principle in ways that should be impossible. The great commander gestured toward the young aliens in the dome. Today, we introduce human cubs to this group for the first time. You will observe the interactions and help us understand what we are seeing. Your perspective as both human and scientist may provide insights our own researchers have missed. As if summoned by Vex's words, another iris door opened at the far side of the dome. A group of human children entered, escorted by guards but not restrained. Sarah's heart clenched as she recognized them. Kids from the colony worlds, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15. They moved with the careful wariness of prey animals in predator territory. But she also saw something else in their posture. Curiosity rather than terror. The young Zephyrians immediately took notice of the newcomers. Several moved toward them with the stalking gait that Sarah had observed in the adult guards. She tensed, expecting violence, but what happened instead left her speechless. One of the human girls, perhaps 8 years old with tangled brown hair, sat down in the center of the group. Instead of running or cowering as the young Zephyrians approached, she simply began running her fingers through her hair, smoothing out the knots with gentle, repetitive motions. The young predators stopped their advance, their large eyes fixed on this simple, inexplicable behavior. And then something extraordinary happened. One of the smallest Zephyrian cubs, instead of pouncing on what should have been easy prey, settled down nearby and began attempting to mimic the girl's movements. Its claws were poorly suited for grooming, but it persisted with intense concentration, running its talons through the darker fur along its neck and shoulders. Within minutes, other cubs, both Zephyrian and alien, had joined them. The dome filled with the soft sounds of grooming, of young creatures caring for themselves and each other in ways that clearly violated every principle of predator hierarchy that governed Zephyrian society. Sarah looked up at Vex and saw something she never expected to see in the face of an apex predator, confusion bordering on fear. "This is what we do not understand," Vex said quietly. "Your cubs transform ours, not through strength or cunning, but through something we have no name for. Our young begin to display behaviors that should be impossible for their species." Sarah watched the children and cubs below, her scientific mind racing. The human girl had created something unprecedented in this space, a moment of peace and care that was spreading like a contagion among species that had been bred for millennia to hunt and kill. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. 18 months since we began the human collection protocol," Vex replied. "The effect appears to be permanent. Cubs exposed to human behavior retain these modifications, even after the humans are removed. Our specialists recommend terminating the human specimens and destroying any contaminated cubs." Sarah felt ice in her veins. Contaminated cubs that no longer demonstrate proper predatory responses. Cubs that protect the weak instead of culling them. Cubs that share resources instead of competing for them. Vex's voice held a note of something that might have been regret. cubs that can no longer serve the Dominion as hunters. As she watched the mixed group of young beings below, Sarah began to understand what the Zephyrians couldn't see. They weren't witnessing contamination or defective behavior. They were seeing the emergence of something that their predator-dominated galaxy had never experienced: the possibility of cooperation across species lines. The human children weren't turning the alien cubs into humans. They were showing them an alternative to the eternal hunt that had defined interstellar civilization for 10,000 years. And in that possibility lay either humanity's salvation or its destruction, depending on how the Zephyrian Dominion chose to respond to this unprecedented challenge to their fundamental understanding of life itself. 3 weeks passed in the observation dome, and Sarah watched as something unprecedented unfolded before her eyes. The initial grooming session had been just the beginning. Each day, the human children were brought to interact with the young aliens. And each day, the changes became more pronounced. The small Zephyrian cub that had first imitated the hair-brushing motion had begun seeking out the human girl, Emma, whenever the groups were brought together. Sarah had learned the children's names by listening to their conversations, and Emma had become something of a focal point for the interspecies interactions. Emma seemed completely unaware of the revolutionary nature of her influence. She treated the alien cubs the same way she had likely treated her friend back on whatever colony world she had called home, with easy affection and casual kindness that appeared to be more powerful than any weapon in the Zephyrian arsenal. Sarah observed as Emma showed the young Zephyrian, whom she had named Keeper, how to braid grass into simple patterns. The cub's claws made the task nearly impossible, but Keeper persisted with intense concentration, occasionally chittering in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as expressions of frustration rather than aggression. The behavioral modification continues to accelerate, Great Commander Vex noted during one of their daily analysis sessions. The Predator leader had taken to joining Sarah for these observations. Its own scientific curiosity clearly engaged despite the threat these developments posed to its worldview. Sarah watched as Keeper successfully completed a small grass braid and immediately brought it to Emma for approval. The human girl's delighted response sent ripples of what could only be described as joy through the young Zephyrian's body language. "It's not modification," Sarah said carefully. "It's development. You're seeing these cubs discover capacities that were already present in their species but have been suppressed by your cultural emphasis on predation." Vex's large eyes fixed on her with the intensity she had come to associate with the commander's efforts to understand concepts that had no equivalent in Zephyrian society. "You suggest that cooperation is natural for predator species?" "I'm suggesting that the capacity for both competition and cooperation exists in all complex social species," Sarah replied. "On Earth, we've observed wolves that adopt orphan cubs from other packs, dolphins that rescue drowning humans, and even sharks that form cooperative hunting groups. Your society has simply chosen to develop only the competitive aspects of your nature." Below them, a more complex scene was unfolding. Emma had organized the mixed group of cubs into teams for what appeared to be a construction project involving the dome's scattered enrichment materials. Instead of competing for resources, the young beings were collaborating to build increasingly elaborate structures. Sarah noticed that the Zephyrian cubs were naturally taking on supportive roles, using their strength to lift heavier materials while the more dexterous species handled detailed work. The humans seemed to function as coordinators, somehow intuiting how to organize the group's efforts for maximum efficiency. "This is troubling," Vex admitted, though its voice held more fascination than alarm. "Our cubs display greater problem-solving capabilities when working with humans than they have ever shown in traditional hunting exercises." What Vex didn't mention, but Sarah had observed, was that the adult Zephyrian guards had begun displaying subtle changes as well. They watched the children's activities with increasing interest rather than the bored indifference they had shown initially. Several had begun unconsciously mimicking some of the more basic cooperative gestures they observed. The most dramatic change had occurred in a guard named Talon, who had been assigned to monitor the human children during their rest periods. Sarah had watched as Emma, suffering from nightmares about the raid on her colony, had awakened crying in the middle of a sleep cycle. Instead of maintaining professional distance, Talon had approached her sleeping area and had begun producing a low, rhythmic humming sound that clearly served as a comfort response. When questioned about this behavior later, Talon had been unable to explain its actions. The small human was distressed, it had said simply. The distress was unpleasant to observe. The vocalization seemed to reduce the distress. Sarah realized she was witnessing the emergence of empathy in a species that had evolved to view other beings purely as resources to be exploited. The implications were staggering, not just for the Zephyrian Dominion, but for the entire structure of galactic civilization. The breakthrough came during the 4th week of observations. Emma had been teaching Keeper and several other cubs a simple Earth game called Red Light, Green Light that required cooperation and mutual awareness. The rules were elementary. Move when Emma called green light, freeze when she called red light, and help any player who was struggling to keep up. Sarah watched as the game progressed, noting how the young Zephyrians instinctively moved to support cubs from other species who were having difficulty with the stopping and starting motions. When a small crystalline Veltar youngling stumbled, Keeper immediately offered physical support without any prompting from Emma. That was when the alarm began sounding. Red warning lights flooded the observation dome as automated systems throughout the ship activated emergency protocols. Sarah felt the distinctive vibration patterns that indicated weapon systems coming online and defensive screens activating around the vessel. Great Commander Vex was on its feet instantly, its demeanor shifting from contemplative scientist to military commander in the span of a heartbeat. Battle stations, it commanded into a communication device. Report status. The response came through in rapid bursts of Zephyrian military cant that the translators struggled to parse. Multiple human vessels detected at extreme range. Configuration suggests military flotilla. Estimated time to intercept, 4 standard hours. Sarah's heart leaped. The human military hadn't been completely destroyed in the initial invasion. Somehow, somewhere, they had regrouped and were mounting a rescue operation. But her joy was tempered by the realization of what this meant for the children and cubs in the dome below. In Zephyrian military doctrine, prisoners of war were typically executed rather than allowed to become liabilities during combat operations. Vex seemed to read her thoughts. Standard protocol requires immediate termination of all specimens to prevent intelligence compromise, the commander said, but its voice held an uncertainty that hadn't been there before the weeks of observation. These children aren't intelligence assets, Sarah said quickly. They're just kids who were in the wrong place when your forces arrived. There's no strategic value in killing them. There is also no strategic value in maintaining them during combat operations, Vex countered, but the commander's gaze kept drifting to the dome below, where the mixed group of youngsters had clustered together in response to the alarm sounds. Sarah followed Vex's gaze and saw something that made her catch her breath. The human children had instinctively moved to protect the alien cubs, forming a defensive circle with the youngest beings in the center. But more remarkable was the response of the young Zephyrians and other alien species. Instead of reverting to individual survival behaviors under stress, they had formed protective formations around the human children. Keeper and several of the other Zephyrian cubs had positioned themselves as outer guards, their natural combat instincts serving not to hunt, but to defend those they had come to care about. "Look at them," Sarah said softly. "Your cubs aren't just learning cooperation. They're developing pack loyalty across species lines. That's not a tactical weakness. It's the foundation of something unprecedented." Vex stared down at the scene with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as genuine conflict. As a military commander, the Predator was obligated to follow protocols that had served the Dominion for millennia. But as a being that had spent weeks observing the emergence of entirely new behavioral possibilities, Vex was confronting evidence that challenged everything its species believed about the nature of strength and survival. The communication device crackled again. Great Commander, advanced scouts report human vessels have launched fighter squadrons. Engagement imminent. Request immediate confirmation of specimen termination protocols. Sarah held her breath as Vex studied the mixed group below. Emma had somehow organized the youngsters into a formation that maximized protection while maintaining calm through a series of simple games and songs. The alien cubs were participating fully, their stress responses channeled into cooperative behaviors rather than aggressive ones. Great Commander, the voice from the communicator pressed. Vex was quiet for a long moment, watching his keeper gently helped Emma keep a small Veltar cub distracted from the alarm sounds by showing it how to weave grass patterns. The Zephyrian youngling's movements were careful and precise, its natural strength modified by the gentleness it had learned through weeks of interaction with human children. Belay termination protocols, Vex said finally. Maintain specimens in secure location during combat operations. Double the guard detail. The response was immediate. Great Commander, this contradicts standing operational doctrine. The High Command will require justification for this deviation. Vex looked at Sarah, and she saw something in those predator eyes that she had never expected to witness. Doubt about the fundamental principles that had guided Zephyrian civilization for 10,000 years. The specimens represent unique research materials that may provide strategic advantages in future operations, Vex replied into the communicator. Their value outweighs the tactical risks of maintaining them during engagement. It was a transparent rationalization, and they both knew it. The real reason Vex was protecting the children and cubs had nothing to do with strategic value and everything to do with the fact that 4 weeks of observation had fundamentally altered the commander's understanding of what strength could look like. As the ship prepared for battle, Sarah realized that the approaching human fleet, whatever its military capabilities, was not the most significant threat to the Zephyrian Dominion. The real danger to their empire was currently playing cooperation games in an observation dome, showing young predators that there were alternatives to 10,000 years of conquest and domination. The war for humanity's freedom might be won or lost in the coming hours, but the transformation that would reshape galactic civilization had already begun in the gentle touch of a human child brushing her hair while alien cubs watched and learned. The battle lasted 7 hours and 14 minutes, and when it was over, the Bloodhawk drifted dead in space with its primary systems offline and its hull breached in 6 critical locations. Great Commander Vex had been right about one thing. The human military flotilla had been formidable enough to cripple a Dominion vessel that had conquered dozens of worlds. But they had been wrong about human tactical doctrine. Sarah watched through the dome's transparent walls as sleek human fighters conducted precise boarding operations rather than finishing off the wounded Zephyrian ship. The approaching vessels bore the insignia of the Terran Defense Coalition, and their movement spoke of military units that had learned hard lessons about fighting an enemy that had once seemed invincible. "They're not trying to destroy you," Sarah observed as Vex coordinated damage control efforts through a portable command unit. "They're here for us." The Great Commander's response was a low growl that the translator rendered as bitter acknowledgement. Human tactical thinking continues to confound our strategic models. Any Dominion force would have obliterated this vessel once it was disabled. Recovery operations are inefficient. What Vex didn't say, but Sarah could see in the Predator's body language, was that this inefficiency had saved the lives of everyone aboard the Bloodhawk. The human approach to warfare, focused on rescuing their own rather than maximizing enemy casualties, represented the same fundamental difference in thinking that had emerged in the observation dome over the past month. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows as they waited for the inevitable human boarding parties. The ship's artificial gravity was failing intermittently, and the air recycling systems were operating at barely functional levels. In the dome below, the mixed group of human children and alien cubs had huddled together near the center, with Emma and Keeper working to keep everyone calm despite the obvious danger. Sarah noticed that the stress response had actually strengthened the bonds between the youngsters rather than breaking them down. The human children were sharing their limited rations with alien cubs who couldn't digest human food, while the young Zephyrians and other species used their natural abilities to create protective barriers and maintain watch rotations. The behavioral modifications have become permanent, Vex observed, following Sarah's gaze. Our cubs no longer revert to individual survival responses under extreme stress. This should not be possible. Before Sarah could respond, the dome's emergency access sealed with a sharp hiss, followed by the distinctive sound of cutting tools being applied to the outer hull. The human boarding parties had reached their section of the ship. What will happen to the cubs? Sarah asked as they watched the cutting torches work their way around the access portal. Vex was quiet for a long moment, its large eyes fixed on Keeper as the young Zephyrian carefully braided grass into calming patterns for a frightened Veltar youngling. Dominion protocol requires that contaminated specimens be destroyed to prevent cultural degradation among our populations. These cubs can never return to Zephyrian society as it currently exists. And you agree with that protocol? The question hung in the air between them as sparks from the cutting operations began to shower the far side of the dome. Vex studied Sarah with an expression that seemed to combine predatory assessment with something approaching genuine consideration. For weeks ago, I would have executed these cubs personally, Vex admitted. The preservation of Dominion cultural purity has been my highest duty for 47 years of military service. But observing their development has forced me to question whether cultural purity is the same thing as cultural strength. The cutting sounds stopped abruptly, followed by the whisper of the access portal cycling open. Armed figures in advanced human combat suits entered the dome, their weapons trained on Vex, while medics and support personnel moved quickly toward the group of children and cubs. Sarah recognized the lead figure despite the combat armor, Admiral Chun Wei-Ming, whose strategic brilliance had been one of the few bright spots during humanity's initial resistance to the Zephyrian invasion. He was also, she realized with a start, her older brother. Dr. Chun, Admiral Chun said through his suit's external speakers, his relief obvious despite the electronic distortion. Are you injured? Have you been harmed? I'm fine, Wei-Ming, Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. But we have a complicated situation here. The Admiral's gaze shifted to Vex, and Sarah saw his hand tighten on his sidearm. Stand down, Zephyrian. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender your vessel, and submit to Coalition custody. Vex made no move toward any weapons, instead maintaining the same contemplative posture it had adopted during weeks of observation. Admiral Chun Wei-Ming, the great commander said, its translator rendering the human name with careful precision. Your tactical reputation is known throughout the Dominion. Your sister has proven to be an educational research partner. Don't mistake politeness for weakness, Admiral Chen warned. We've learned how to fight your kind. This rescue operation proves human forces can challenge Dominion superiority. Does it? Vex asked, and Sarah heard something in the alien's tone that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery. You have disabled one vessel and recovered 47 human prisoners. In exchange, you have lost 17 fighters and exposed the location of your remaining fleet assets to Dominion intelligence networks. By traditional military metrics, this engagement represents a significant strategic loss for your forces. Sarah watched her brother process this assessment, saw the moment when he realized that Vex was probably correct about the tactical implications of their rescue operation. The human fleet had won this battle, but at a cost that might prove disastrous in the longer war against the Dominion. But you came anyway, Vex continued. Your species continues to make tactically inefficient choices in order to preserve individuals who could easily be replaced with minimal investment in reproductive resources. This behavior pattern has emerged consistently across all human military engagements with Dominion forces. Admiral Chin's response was sharp. Human lives aren't resources to be calculated and discarded. No, Vex agreed, and Sarah heard something that might have been wonder in the alien commander's voice. There's something else entirely. Something we are still trying to understand. The great commander gestured toward the group of children and cubs who are being carefully evacuated by human medical personnel. Your cubs have demonstrated capabilities that should not exist in any rational universe. They have taken our young, raised to be perfect predators, and transformed them into something that our language has no words to describe. Sarah saw her brother follow Vex's gesture, watched his expression change as he took in a sight of human children and alien cubs helping each other through the evacuation process. Emma was walking hand in hand with Keeper, both of them working to guide smaller youngsters toward the medical teams. The Dominion has conquered over 1,000 species, Vex said quietly. We have perfected techniques for cultural integration that have proven successful across 10,000 years of expansion. Every species eventually adopts our values, accepts our hierarchy, joins our hunting culture. But your species does not integrate. Instead, you transform whatever you touch. Admiral Chun lowered his weapon slowly. What are you saying? I am saying that the Zephyrian Dominion may have encountered something unprecedented. A species that challenges not just our military superiority, but the fundamental principles upon which our civilization is built. Vex studied the ongoing evacuation with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as scientific fascination. These cubs have learned to cooperate across species lines, to sacrifice individual advantage for group welfare, to protect the weak rather than cull them. By our standards, they should be defective, but they demonstrate capabilities that exceed anything our traditional training methods produce. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. You're not just observing human behavior. You're questioning whether the Dominion's entire approach to civilization might be suboptimal. That is a dangerous line of thought for a Zephyrian commander, Vex acknowledged. One that could be considered treasonous by the High Command. But the evidence has become difficult to ignore. Admiral Chun looked between Sarah and Vex, his tactical mind clearly working through implications that extended far beyond the immediate rescue operation. What evidence? Vex gestured toward the evacuation proceeding below them. Your medical personnel are treating alien cubs with the same care they show human children. This should represent a massive tactical error, as these cubs will return to Dominion space carrying intelligence about human capabilities and technologies. Yet you proceed as if their welfare were as important as that of your own species. The great commander paused, watching as Emma refused to leave until all the younger cubs have been safely evacuated, with Keeper standing guard beside her despite clear opportunities to escape or attack the human rescue teams. More significantly, your rescue operation has succeeded not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the same inexplicable behavioral patterns we have observed in your cubs. You prioritize preservation over destruction, cooperation over domination, sacrifice over advantage. These choices should make you vulnerable, but instead they seem to provide capabilities that our strategic models cannot account for. Admiral Chun was quiet for a long moment, processing information that challenged his own understanding of human military doctrine. Are you suggesting that our approach to warfare represents some kind of evolutionary advantage? I'm suggesting that your approach to existence represents something fundamentally different from anything the Dominion has encountered, Vex replied. Something that may render our traditional conquest strategies obsolete. Sarah watched the last of the children and cubs being evacuated, noting how the human rescue teams had automatically included all the alien youngsters in their extraction protocols despite having no specific orders to do so. It was exactly the kind of tactically inefficient behavior that Vex had described, yet it had resulted in intelligence assets that could prove invaluable in understanding Dominion culture and capabilities. What happens now? Admiral Chen asked. Vex studied the empty dome where children and cubs had spent 4 weeks learning to see past 10,000 years of species rivalry. Now we discover whether the galaxy is ready for something entirely new, or whether the weight of established civilization will crush this possibility before it can fully emerge. The great commander moved toward the evacuation portal, then paused to look back at Sarah and her brother. Admiral Chun, your tactical reputation suggests you understand the importance of intelligence assets. I formally request asylum within Coalition space. The statement hit the dome like a physical blow. Sarah stared at Vex, realizing that the alien commander was proposing something that would shatter every precedent in Dominion history. "You want to defect?" Admiral Chen asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I want to learn," Vex corrected. The Cubs who have spent these weeks together represent a proof of concept that could reshape galactic civilization. But understanding how to replicate their development will require cooperation between species that have been enemies for generations. The Dominion will never permit such research. Your coalition might. Sarah looked at her brother and saw the moment when he realized the full implications of Vex's offer. A defecting Zephyrian Great Commander would provide intelligence assets beyond anything the coalition had dreamed of acquiring. But more than that, Vex represented the possibility that the transformation they had witnessed in the observation dome might extend beyond children to the entire structure of interstellar relations. The war between humanity and the Zephyrian Dominion was far from over. But in the ruins of the Bloodhawk, surrounded by evidence that cooperation could triumph over conquest, something new was beginning to take shape that might make traditional warfare obsolete. 6 months after the rescue of the Bloodhawk, the Terran Coalition's research station on Kepler 7 had become the most significant diplomatic and scientific facility in human space. What had begun as a xenobiology project had evolved into something unprecedented, the first truly multi-species collaborative research initiative in galactic history. Dr. Sarah Chun stood in the observation gallery of Laboratory Complex 7, watching as Emma worked with Keeper and a group of young beings from 12 different species. The children had grown in the months since their rescue, but more importantly, they had continued to develop the cooperative behaviors that had first emerged aboard the Zephyrian vessel. The current project was ambitious even by the standards they had established. Emma had proposed creating what she called a universal playground, where young beings from any species could interact safely regardless of their biological differences or cultural backgrounds. The engineering challenges were substantial, but the social implications were revolutionary. The atmospheric processors are maintaining optimal conditions for all 12 species simultaneously, reported Dr. Marcus Webb, the mining engineer who had become one of the project's most effective technical coordinators. Gravity variations, atmospheric composition, lighting spectrums, temperature gradients. Everything is functioning within acceptable parameters. Sarah nodded, but her attention remained focused on the activities below. Keeper was teaching a group of Veltar younglings how to use their crystalline structure resonances to create musical harmonies with human singing voices. The songs weren't beautiful by any traditional standard, but they represented something entirely new, art created through genuine interspecies collaboration. The Coalition Council is meeting again today, Admiral Chun informed her as he joined the observation group. They're still debating whether to expand the program or restrict it to current participants. The debate had been raging for months. Conservative elements within the coalition argued that their resources should be focused on military preparations for the inevitable Zephyrian counterattack. Progressive factions insisted that the research station represented humanity's best hope for long-term survival in a galaxy dominated by predator species. What neither side wanted to acknowledge was that the decision might no longer be entirely up to human leadership. "How many requests for asylum have we received this week?" Sarah asked. 17, Admiral Chen replied grimly. 2 more Zephyrian commanders, 3 Veltar research specialists, and 12 individuals from species we've never even heard of before. Word is spreading through Dominion space faster than our intelligence networks can track. Great Commander Vex approached their group, moving with the careful precision that had become characteristic of Zephyrians working in multi-species environments. The former Dominion officer had adapted to coalition protocols with remarkable speed, but Sarah knew that the adjustment process was far more complex than it appeared. "The morning integration session has concluded," Vex reported. "Behavioral assessments show continued positive development across all species groups. Aggression incidents remain at 0%. Cooperation metrics have improved by 12% over last week, and cross-species communication effectiveness has increased to levels that exceed our theoretical models. The statistics were impressive, but Sarah was more interested in the changes she observed in Vex itself. The former Predator commander had spent months learning to work alongside beings it had once viewed as prey, and the transformation was profound. Vex still moved with predatory grace, but that physical capability now served protective rather than aggressive purposes. "There's something else," Vex continued, its voice carrying the careful modulation that indicated sensitive information. "I received communication from within Dominion space this morning. Unauthorized transmission, but verified through protocols I established with sympathetic elements before my defection." Admiral Chen straightened. "What kind of communication?" "Reports of spontaneous behavioral modifications among Dominion youth populations on 17 different worlds," Vex replied. "Cubs and adolescents are beginning to display cooperative behaviors similar to what we observed in the initial experiments. The phenomenon appears to be spreading without direct human contact." Sarah felt her breath catch. That should be impossible. The behavioral changes we documented required direct interaction with human children over extended periods. "Unless the changes are more fundamental than we understood," Vex suggested. "What if exposure to cooperative behavioral patterns creates cascading effects that spread through social networks? Young beings who learn cooperation from humans might teach those behaviors to others, who teach them to others, and so on." Dr. Webb looked up from his technical displays. "You're describing a cultural contagion effect, behavioral modifications that spread like a virus through populations." "The implications are staggering," Admiral Chen said quietly. "If cooperation can spread through Dominion populations without direct human intervention, we might be looking at the spontaneous collapse of their entire social structure." Sarah studied the activities below, where Emma was mediating a dispute between young beings from 3 different species by teaching them a simple conflict resolution technique she had learned in elementary school. The human girl applied the method naturally, intuitively, as if peaceful conflict resolution were the most obvious approach to disagreement. "It's not a weapon," Sarah said finally. "What we're seeing isn't a tactical advantage or a strategic asset. It's evolution in action. Species throughout the galaxy are discovering that cooperation produces better outcomes than competition, and once they learn that lesson, they can't unlearn it." Vex studied her with the intense focus that had become familiar during their months of collaboration. "You suggest that the changes are irreversible?" "I'm suggesting that they're inevitable," Sarah replied. "Look at our own history. Humans went through the same transition thousands of years ago, when we learned that cooperation within tribal groups produced survival advantages over pure individual competition. Once we made that leap, we eventually extended cooperative behaviors to larger and larger groups until we achieved planetary civilization. But the Dominion has maintained predator-based culture for 10,000 years, Admiral Chen pointed out. If cooperation were truly inevitable, wouldn't they have discovered it naturally? They maintained predator culture through conquest and territorial expansion, Vex answered. As long as there were always new hunting grounds and fresh prey species, competition for resources remained advantageous. But the galaxy is finite. Eventually, even the Dominion would have reached the limits of expansion and been forced to choose between internal warfare or alternative social structures. Sarah felt pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place. "We accelerated the process. Human children provided a proof of concept that cooperation could work even among species with completely different evolutionary backgrounds. Once young Dominion citizens saw that alternative working, they began experimenting with it themselves. The implications were staggering not just for the Dominion, but for every species in the galaxy. If cooperation could indeed spread through populations as a cultural contagion, then the rigid hierarchies that had defined interstellar civilization for millennia might be collapsing simultaneously across hundreds of worlds." "Dr. Chun," came a voice through the facility's communication system. "Please report to communications immediately. Priority Alpha message from Coalition Command." Sarah exchanged glances with her brother and Vex. Priority Alpha communications were reserved for threats to the survival of human civilization. They arrived at the communications center to find the duty officer looking stunned. Dr. Chun, we're receiving a transmission from the Dominion High Command. They're requesting immediate diplomatic contact with coalition leadership. Admiral Chun stepped forward. Requesting? The Dominion doesn't request anything. They demand, they conquer, they take. They don't request. Sir, the transmission specifically asks to open negotiations for what they term behavioral research cooperation protocols. They're offering to share Dominion scientific databases in exchange for access to our childhood development programs. Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet. The Zephyrian Dominion was offering to negotiate, not for territory or resources or military advantage, but for the right to learn how cooperation worked. There's more, the duty officer continued. We're receiving similar transmission requests from the Veltar Consortium, the Draconian Empire, and at least 6 other major galactic powers. They all want to establish diplomatic relations, and they all specifically mention interest in our social development research. Vex stared at the communication displays with an expression Sarah had never seen before. This should not be possible. These civilizations have been enemies for millennia. The idea that they would simultaneously seek cooperation with humans. Unless they're all dealing with the same internal pressures, Sarah suggested. If cooperative behaviors are spreading through their youth populations, their traditional social structures are probably destabilizing. They need to understand what's happening before their entire civilizations collapse into chaos. Admiral Chun activated the priority communication channel. Coalition Command, this is Admiral Chun at Kepler 7 Research Station. Confirm reception of multiple diplomatic contact requests from galactic powers. The response was immediate. Confirmed, Admiral. We're seeing the same phenomenon across all sectors. Every major civilization in this galaxy has simultaneously requested diplomatic contact for the first time in recorded history. Command is declaring a state of galactic emergency and requesting immediate strategic assessment from all personnel with expertise in xenocultural dynamics. Sarah looked through the observation window at Emma and Keeper and their multi-species group of friends still working together on their playground project with the unconscious ease of children who had never learned that cooperation was supposed to be impossible. The assessment is simple, Sarah said into the communicator. The children won. They've introduced an idea into galactic civilization that's proving more powerful than any military force in history. Every species that learns cooperation becomes incapable of returning to pure predator-prey relationships. Are you saying we've accidentally conquered the galaxy? Admiral Chen asked. No, Sarah replied, watching as Emma taught a young Draconian how to braid grass into patterns that could be shared with beings who had completely different manual capabilities. I'm saying the galaxy is conquering itself. Species by species, world by world, they're choosing cooperation over conquest because they're finally seeing that it works. Vex studied the children below with what Sarah recognized as scientific fascination mixed with something approaching reverence. In Dominion culture, we have legends about the end of the hunt. Ancient stories that speak of a time when predator and prey would exist in harmony. We always interpreted these as fantasies, impossible futures that could never exist in reality. Maybe they weren't fantasies, Sarah suggested. Maybe they were predictions. Descriptions of what would happen when species finally evolved beyond the need for eternal warfare. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma looked up at the observation gallery and waved, her gesture encompassing all the adults watching regardless of their species. Beside her, Keeper and youngsters from a dozen different worlds waved as well, their movements synchronized in a display of casual interspecies friendship that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The communication system crackled again. Admiral Chun, Coalition Command, is requesting immediate consultation on diplomatic protocols for unprecedented multi-species negotiations. How do we conduct peace talks with civilizations we've never been able to communicate with before? Sarah smiled as she watched Emma organize her multi-species group for their next collaborative project. We asked the children to teach us. 2 years after the first diplomatic contact requests, the former Kepler-7 research station had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. The Interspecies Cooperation Institute, a massive facility orbiting the system's primary star, where representatives from 47 different civilizations worked together on projects that would have been unimaginable under the old order. Dr. Sarah Chan walked through the Institute's central hub, a vast spherical chamber where beings from dozens of species moved in carefully choreographed patterns that accommodated their different environmental needs, communication methods, and social behaviors. Atmospheric zones shifted seamlessly from one region to another. Gravity fields adjusted to support everything from the ethereal cloud zingers to the massive stonekin, and translation systems had evolved far beyond simple language conversion to include emotional context, cultural nuance, and species-specific behavioral cues. At the center of it all, in a transparent observation sphere that had become known as the Harmony Chamber, Emma worked with what was now officially called the First Generation, the original group of children and cubs whose interactions had triggered the transformation of galactic civilization. Emma was 17 now, no longer the small girl who had unconsciously taught alien predators how to groom each other. But she retained the same intuitive understanding of cooperation that had made her such an effective bridge between species. Beside her, Keeper had grown into a magnificent adult Zephyrian whose strength served protective rather than predatory purposes, and whose pack loyalty now extended to beings across the known galaxy. The morning session focused on resource allocation protocols for the Outer Rim territories. Emma reported as Sarah joined the observation group. We've got 17 different species claiming historical rights to the same star systems, but nobody wants to fight about it anymore. So we're working out sharing arrangements based on each species' actual needs rather than traditional territorial claims. Sarah marveled at how casually Emma discussed concepts that were reshaping the fundamental structure of galactic politics. The young woman approached interstellar diplomacy the same way she had once approached playground disputes, with the assumption that reasonable beings could always find solutions that worked for everyone. Any particular challenges? Sarah asked. The Crystal Hearts keep trying to give away territories they've claimed because they feel bad about taking up space that other species might want, Emma replied with a slight smile. And the Storm Riders are offering to share their traditional hunting grounds with everyone, which is sweet but completely impractical because most species can't survive in gas giant atmospheres. These were good problems, Sarah reflected. Challenges that arose from too much generosity rather than too much aggression. The transformation that had begun with simple grooming behaviors had evolved into something that was fundamentally altering how species related to each other across the galaxy. The Coalition Council meeting went well, Admiral Chan announced as he approached their group. Final approval for the galaxy-wide cooperation protocols passed unanimously. Every major civilization has agreed to transition from territorial competition to resource sharing over the next 5 years. Great Commander Vex, now holding the title of Interspecies Strategic Coordinator, nodded approvingly. The Dominion High Command has formally dissolved the conquest hierarchy that governed our civilization for 10,000 years. Military vessels are being converted to exploration and research platforms. The transition is proceeding more smoothly than our most optimistic projections suggested. Sarah watched the activities in the Harmony Chamber, where young beings from species that had been mortal enemies for millennia worked together on projects that required capabilities no single species possessed. A group that included humans, Zephyrians, Veltar, Draconians, and several species she still couldn't identify were collaborating on what appeared to be a three-dimensional sculpture that incorporated mathematics, music, and something that transcended both. What are they working on? She asked. They call it a harmony map, Emma explained. It's supposed to show how different types of intelligence and creativity can combine to produce results that none of us could achieve individually. The mathematics comes from a Veltar, the aesthetic principles from the Draconians, the emotional resonance patterns from humans, and the structural integrity concepts from the Zephyrians. But the final result is something completely new. Sarah studied the complex structure taking shape in the chamber below. It was beautiful in ways that challenged every species-specific definition of beauty she knew, yet somehow appealed to aesthetic sensibilities that seemed universal. More importantly, it represented proof that cooperation could produce innovations that were genuinely impossible under competitive paradigms. Dr. Chun came a voice through the facility's communication system. Please report to the Deep Space Communications Array. We're receiving a signal from outside the galaxy. The announcement sent ripples of excitement through the observation area. Despite 2 years of unprecedented progress in interspecies cooperation, their efforts have been limited to the species and civilizations already present in their galaxy. The possibility of contact with intelligence from beyond their local group represented an entirely new order of challenge and opportunity. They arrived at the communications array to find the facility's best xenolinguists and cryptographers working frantically to decode a signal that was unlike anything in their databases. Dr. Lisa Park, the facility's chief communications specialist, looked up as they approached. "It's definitely artificial," she reported. "Complex mathematical structures embedded in quantum field fluctuations, transmitted across intergalactic distances using principles we don't fully understand. But the most interesting part is the content." "You've decoded the message?" Admiral Chen asked. "We've decoded enough to understand the basic concept," Dr. Park replied. "They're asking about what they call the cooperation phenomenon. Apparently, our transformation has been visible to observers outside the galaxy. Species that have been monitoring galactic civilizations for millions of years are seeing behavioral changes that they describe as unprecedented." Sarah felt a chill of possibility. How long have they been monitoring us? The message includes historical data that suggests continuous observation dating back approximately 12 million years, Dr. Park said. They've watched the rise and fall of thousands of galactic civilizations, but they've never seen anything like what's happened here in the past 2 years. Vex studied the communication displays with a focused intensity that had made it such an effective military commander. What specifically do they find unprecedented about our development? According to the message, every galactic civilization they've observed eventually reaches what they call competitive saturation, a point where territorial expansion becomes impossible and species turn to internal warfare until they destroy themselves, Dr. Park explained. The average lifespan for a galactic civilization is approximately 4,000 years from the development of interstellar travel to final collapse. "But we've broken that pattern," Sarah said, beginning to understand the implications. "More than broken it. We've reversed it. Instead of competitive saturation leading to collapse, we've achieved what they term cooperative synthesis, species learning to work together in ways that increase rather than decrease their collective capabilities," Dr. Park confirmed. They want to understand how it happened, because they believe it might be applicable to other galaxies where civilizations are approaching competitive saturation. Admiral Chun was quiet for a moment, processing information that placed their recent transformation in a cosmic context none of them had imagined. "Are you saying that what happened here could be exported? That other galaxies could learn cooperation the same way our species did?" The message suggests that possibility, but they emphasize that they don't understand the mechanism that triggered our transformation, Dr. Park replied. They're requesting permission to send scientific observers to study what they call the cooperation catalyst. Sarah looked through the communications center's observation windows at the Harmony Chamber, where Emma and the first generation continued their work on projects that were reshaping the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. The cooperation catalyst wasn't a technology or a weapon or a strategic resource. It was a 17-year-old human girl who had once brushed her hair while alien predators watched, and learned that there were alternatives to 10,000 years of conquest and domination. "Send a response," Sarah said to Dr. Park. "Tell them they're welcome to send observers, but they should understand that our cooperation catalyst isn't something that can be extracted or replicated through traditional scientific methods." "What should we tell them it is?" Dr. Park asked. Sarah smiled as she watched Emma patiently explain some complex concept to a group of young beings whose species had been enemies for millennia before learning that friendship was possible. Tell them it's childhood. Tell them it's the capacity to see others as potential friends rather than inevitable threats. Tell them it's what happens when someone demonstrates that cooperation works better than competition, and others are young enough to believe it. Dr. Chun, Vex said quietly, if this phenomenon can indeed be exported to other galaxies, we may be looking at the transformation of cosmic civilization itself. Species throughout the universe could learn to cooperate rather than compete. The message mentions something else, Dr. Park added. They refer to our galaxy as having achieved what they call evolutionary transcendence. They suggest that we've become something unprecedented in cosmic history, a galactic civilization that has learned to grow through cooperation rather than consumption. Sarah watched the harmony map taking shape in the chamber below, its complex beauty representing the combined creativity of species that had once devoted their best efforts to destroying each other. The structure was still incomplete, but its emerging patterns suggested possibilities that none of the contributing species could have imagined independently. How long until the extragalactic observers arrive? Admiral Chen asked. The message indicates approximately 18 months for their fastest vessels to reach us, Dr. Park replied. They're using some form of technology that allows travel between galaxies, but even their advanced propulsion systems require significant time to cover intergalactic distances. That gives us time to prepare, Sarah said. Time to make sure we understand our own transformation well enough to help others achieve something similar. And time for Emma and the first generation to develop their cooperation techniques further, Vex added. If they are indeed the cooperation catalyst, their continued development may be crucial for successfully transferring these behavioral patterns to other galactic civilizations. Sarah nodded, watching as Emma organized her multi-species group for another collaborative project. The young woman was unconsciously creating protocols for cooperation that were more sophisticated than anything formal diplomacy had ever achieved, simply because she approached every interaction with the assumption that reasonable beings could always find ways to work together. Dr. Chun, came Emma's voice through the communication system. We've finished the morning harmony map, and we'd like to show it to everyone. Could you ask people to gather in the central hub? Of course, Sarah replied. We'll be right there. As they walked back toward the central hub, Sarah reflected on how profoundly their understanding of civilization had changed. 2 years ago, the galaxy had been dominated by species that viewed existence as an eternal struggle between predators and prey. Today, those same species were working together on projects that benefited everyone, learning to see diversity as strength rather than threat. And in 18 months, observers from other galaxies would arrive to learn how a human child brushing her hair had triggered the greatest transformation in cosmic history. They gathered in the central hub as beings from 47 different species came together to view what the first generation had created. The harmony map was displayed in the chamber's center, its complex structure visible from every viewing angle. It was impossible to describe in any single species' aesthetic terms, yet somehow beautiful to everyone present. Emma stood before the assembled crowd, no longer a small girl, but a young woman who had become the informal leader of the greatest cooperation project in galactic history. Beside her, Keeper and the other members of the first generation represented proof that species could transcend millions of years of evolutionary programming when given alternatives to eternal conflict. The harmony map shows what we've learned working together, Emma said simply. Every species contributed something unique, but the final result belongs to all of us. It's beautiful in ways none of us could have created alone, and it works in ways none of us fully understand individually. She gestured toward the complex structure, which seemed to shift and flow as observers from different species looked at it from their various perspectives. But the most important thing about the harmony map isn't what it shows us about cooperation. It's what it shows us about possibility. Emma's voice carried across the hub, translated into dozens of languages and communication methods, yet somehow retaining the simple sincerity that had made her such an effective bridge between species. 2 years ago, most of our species had never even met each other except in warfare. Today, we're creating things together that none of us imagined were possible. In 18 months, beings from other galaxies will come here to learn how we did it. The young woman paused, her gaze encompassing the incredible diversity of beings gathered in the hub: predators and prey, ancient enemies, and recent allies, species so different that they required completely different environments to survive, yet somehow managing to work together. What we'll tell them is simple, Emma continued. Cooperation isn't a technology or a strategy or a political system. It's a choice. It's deciding to see others as potential friends instead of inevitable threats. It's choosing to build rather than destroy, to share rather than hoard, to grow together rather than fight alone. She smiled, and that expression somehow translated across every species barrier present. And once you make that choice, once you really understand that cooperation works better than competition, you can't go back. Because you've seen what's possible when different kinds of intelligence work together. As applause and approval expressions rippled through the hub in 47 different forms, Sarah realized that Emma was right. They hadn't conquered the galaxy through superior technology or strategic brilliance. They had transformed it by demonstrating that cooperation was possible. And that demonstration had proven so compelling that species throughout the galaxy had chosen to abandon 10,000 years of competitive civilization. Now, beings from other galaxies were coming to learn how a human child's simple gesture of grooming had become the catalyst for the greatest transformation in cosmic history. And in 18 months, Emma and the first generation would teach them that the secret wasn't in the gesture itself, but in the willingness to believe that even the fiercest predators could learn to be gentle when shown that gentleness was not weakness, but a different kind of strength entirely.